Imagine you're standing out in this wide open field, right?
Yeah.
And you are holding this heavy 3-foot-long iron tube.
Right.
You have exactly 20 seconds to bite open a paper packet of explosive powder, pour it down that tube, shove a heavy lead ball in after it, ram it down with a metal rod, and put this tiny brass cap on the firing mechanism.
And you have to do all of that using fine motor skill.
Exactly. While standing completely upright. Well, I mean, literally 100 people across the field are actively trying to kill you. If your handshake, you die. If you drop the ramrod, you die.
It is, it's just a nightmare scenario. I mean, the sheer mechanical terror of that reality is something that we, modern people who are so accustomed to automation and instant results, we really struggle to genuinely comprehend it.
Yeah, but today, we're going to make you comprehend it. Welcome to the deep dive. We are transporting you, the listener, to a very specific, incredibly volatile 15-year window that just, well, it fundamentally altered the history of warfare.
We're talking about the window from 1861 to 1876.
Right, the Ordnance Revolution.
Yeah.
Because this isn't some dusty recounting of dates. It's a technological thriller, really, about a rapidly evolving machine, the firearm, and the deadly institutional consequences of ignoring that innovation.
Yeah, and to do this right, we are drawing extensively from a specific set of sources today. Primarily, we're looking at strategic obsolescence, ordnance doctrine, and the Little Bighorn.
Which is fantastic, by the way.
It really is. And we're pairing that with some groundbreaking archaeological data gathered directly from the battlefield, plus the historical, the really harrowing testaments of the men who actually held these weapons in their hands.
Okay, let's unpack this. But before we do, I want to set some ground rules with you.
Yeah.
We're deliberately setting aside these sweeping political debates of the 1870s today.
Right, we're focusing in.
Yeah, we're completely bypassing the wider maneuvers of the Battle of the Little Bighorn, and we're ignoring the famous larger-than-life personalities that usually dominate this story well, unless their decisions directly impact the hardware.
Because our mission here is to zoom in microscopically on the raw data of survival. The mechanics, the doctrine, the metal, and the powder.
Because if you strip away the mythology of the frontier, what you are left with is a story about pieces of metal interacting with other pieces of metal under extreme duress.
Exactly. And to understand the massive leap in technology that culminated at the Little Bighorn, we first have to establish our baseline.
Right.
We have to go back to 1861, to the dawn of the American Civil War, and look at what it actually meant to, fire a gun in combat.
So put us in the boots of a soldier in 1861. What am I holding, and what do I have to do to make it work?
You are likely holding a muzzle-loading rifled musket. The two workhorses of this era were the American-made Springfield model 1861 and the British-made pattern 1853 Enfield.
Okay, so these were the standard issue.
Yeah, and they were formidable weapons for their time. They had rifled barrels, meaning spiral grooves inside the barrel spun the bullet, which gives it far greater range and accuracy than the older smoothbore muskets.
But there's a catch, right?
A huge catch. The cost of that accuracy was time. They were agonizingly slow to load.
Define agonizingly slow. Because, I mean, in a firefight, a few seconds feels like an absolute lifetime.
Well, for a highly trained, completely calm soldier operating under ideal conditions, maybe on a target range with a gentle breeze, you are looking at a maximum rate of fire of about 3 shots a minute.
3 shots. Wow. So 20 seconds per shot. Walk me through the physical, tactile process of that. Why did it take so long?
Let's break it down into steps because every single step is a liability. So you've just fired, your barrel is smoking. The first thing you have to do is reach around your hip, pop open a stiff leather cartridge box, and pull out a paper cartridge.
Okay, and what exactly is that?
It is quite literally a rolled tube of paper holding a pre-measured charge of black powder and a lead bullet, which was known as a mini ball.
And your hands are probably slick with sweat. Maybe you're wearing thick wool in the summer heat, but you have to, precisely manipulate this fragile paper tube.
Yes, and it gets worse. You bring that paper cartridge up to your mouth, you clamp your teeth down on the twisted end of the paper, and you physically bite it off.
I've always heard about this, but I try to imagine the sensory experience of it. You're actually tasting the gunpowder, right?
You absolutely are. And black powder in 1861 is this crude mixture of saltpeter, sulfur, and charcoal. When you tear that paper with your teeth, that powder hits your tongue.
Ugh, that sounds awful.
It's deeply acrid. It immediately dries out your throat, it burns your lips, and, the sulfur smells like rotting eggs.
Right.
You then hold your long rifle vertically, and you carefully pour the loose powder from that torn paper down into the muzzle of the barrel.
So now you just have a pile of explosive dust sitting at the bottom of a 3-foot metal tube.
Exactly. Next, you squeeze the heavy lead bullet out of the remaining paper and you seat it into the top of the muzzle.
Yeah.
But it's just sitting there. To actually make the weapon fire, that bullet has to be pressed firmly down against the powder chart.
Right, which means the ramrod.
Yes. You reach under the barrel and draw your metal ramrod.
This is the part that always seemed so deeply flawed to me. You are wielding this long metal stick, flipping it around in the air.
It was incredibly clumsy. You draw the ramrod, pull it all the way out, flip it end over end, insert it into the muzzle, and physically push that lead ball all the way down the barrel.
And you have to push hard, right?
Yeah, you give it a firm tap to make sure it's seated properly. Then you have to pull the ramrod back out, flip it end over end again, and return it to its storage channel underneath the barrel.
Wait, what happens if I'm panicking? Because, again, people are actively shooting at me, and I just forget and leave the ramrod in the barrel.
If you leave the ramrod in the barrel and pull the trigger, well, you have just shot your ramrod at the enemy.
Oh, man.
And congratulations, your rifle is now completely useless for the remainder of the battle. You can't load the next shot without it. You're basically now holding a 9-pound club.
That is genuinely terrifying.
Yeah.
Okay, so I've poured the powder, seated the ball, rammed it down, and put the ramrod away. Am I finally ready to shoot?
Not yet. The powder is inside, but you need a spark to ignite it. You have to bring the rifle down, pull the heavy iron hammer back to the half-cock safety position. Then you reach into a separate small leather pouch on your belt and dig out a percussion cap.
What's that look like?
It's a tiny piece of brass about the size of a pencil eraser, and it's filled with a microscopic amount of fulminate of mercury.
Try manipulating something the size of a pencil eraser when your hands are shaking with pure adrenaline.
It's nearly impossible. You have to pinch that tiny cap and press it onto a small metal cone called the nipple, which is located just under the hammer.
Okay.
Finally, you pull the hammer all the way back to full cock, raise the weapon to your shoulder, take aim, and pull the trigger. The hammer falls, crushes the brass cap, the spark travels down a tiny channel into the barrel, ignites the powder, and the gun fires.
Assuming, of course, that everything works perfectly.
Right.
But here's the thing that really sticks in my mind about all this. You cannot do that lying down. You can't easily pour loose powder down a 3-foot vertical tube while huddled behind a log.
No, you can't.
This mechanical process forces the soldier to stand up, fully exposed, for 20 seconds at a time.
That is the core tragedy of 1861 infantry tactics. The mechanics of the weapon completely dictated the doctrine. Because the weapon required you to stand upright to load, armies were forced to arrange their men in long standing lines, shoulder to shoulder.
Basically maximizing their density to deliver concentrated volleys of fire.
Exactly, while simultaneously turning themselves into massive, unmissable targets.
I have to challenge this 3 shots a minute statistic, though. If you were standing in a line, fumbling with paper, tasting sulfur, flipping a ramrod, and pinching a tiny brass cap while cannonballs are tearing through the men right next to you, I mean, how often does human panic just completely override the training?
All the time.
Right, because 3 shots a minute assumes a robot is operating the gun.
And the historical and archaeological records back up your skepticism entirely. Human beings are not robots, and fine motor skills evaporate the second the sympathetic nervous system dumps adrenaline into your bloodstream.
Yeah, fight or flight.
We have terrifying physical evidence of this from the Civil War. After the Battle of Gettysburg in 1863, Union ordnance officers went across the battlefield collecting the discarded rifles of the dead and wounded. They gathered nearly 28,000 muskets.
Okay, and what did they find when they inspected them?
They found that nearly half of them, about 12,000 rifles, were improperly loaded. And when I say improperly loaded, I mean they were loaded multiple times without ever being fired.
Wait, how do you load a gun multiple times without firing it? Does it just not go off?
It's a phenomenon born entirely of stress and sensory overload. A terrified soldier would go through the motions, he would bite the paper, pour the powder, ram the bullet down, but in his panic, he might forget to put the tiny brass percussion cap on the nipple.
Oh, wow.
Or the cap might be defective. He raises the rifle, pulls the trigger, the hammer falls with a click. But because thousands of other guns are firing around him, the roar of the battle is absolutely deafening.
So he literally cannot hear his own gun not going off.
He cannot hear it. And because the weapons recoil so heavily in the jostle of the line, he assumes he felt the kick. He thinks he fired. So he reaches for another paper cartridge. He bites it, pours the powder, and rams a second bullet directly on top of the first one.
Jesus.
He pulls the trigger. Nothing. He does it again.
He is just stacking powder and lead in the barrel over and over.
Exactly. The ordnance teams at Gettysburg found rifles with 3, 5, even up to 10 or more unspent loads stacked one on top of the other, filling the barrel all the way to the muzzle.
That is so dark.
Think about the psychology of that. You have a young man standing in the middle of a slaughterhouse, frantically executing a complex mechanical pantomime over and over again, completely terrified, basically performing the actions of combat without ever once shooting back.
That paints an incredibly bleak picture. It's the baseline of terror. A weapon that is slow, forces you to expose yourself, requires fine motor skills you don't have under stress, and is highly prone to catastrophic user error.
And that baseline of terror created a desperate hunger for innovation. The obvious question every soldier and engineer was asking in the 1860s was, how do we shoot faster?
Right.
And more importantly, how do we shoot without having to manually perform this delicate 9-step dance from the muzzle every single time?
Which opens the door for the first truly unimaginable leap in firepower. If the muzzle-loader was the hand axe, we are about to look at the invention of the chainsaw. I'm talking about the machine gun, specifically the Gatling gun.
Yes. Dr. Richard Gatling invents his gun in 1861, practically at the same moment the Civil War is erupting. And Gatling is a fascinating figure. He was actually a medical doctor.
A medical doctor invented the machine gun.
He did. He looked at the horrific casualties of the war, not just from bullets, but from disease in the massive army camps. His theory was that if he could invent a weapon that allowed one man to wield the firepower of 100 men, armies wouldn't need to be so large.
Wow.
He genuinely believed his machine of mass destruction would ultimately save lives by shrinking the size of armies.
It is an incredibly dark irony that the first machine gun was invented as a life-saving medical device.
Yeah.
But let's look at the specs of this machine. By the time we get to the 1870s, Gatling has really refined his invention. We just established that a trained soldier could fire 3 rounds a minute. What could the 1870s Gatling gun do?
The Gatling gun of that era, specifically the models tested by the military, could sustain a theoretical rate of fire of 350 rounds a minute.
From 3 to 350. That's an 11,000% increase in firepower. It's a complete paradigm shift.
It is a complete snapping of the rules of reality on the battlefield. Instead of a single barrel, the Gatling gun featured a cluster of multiple rifled barrels, usually 6 to 10 of them, arranged in a cylinder.
Okay.
A gunner stood behind it and turned a hand crank. As the crank turned, the cluster of barrels rotated. A mechanism automatically dropped a brass cartridge into a barrel, closed the breech, fired the cartridge, extracted the empty casing, and loaded the next one, all in a continuous flowing cycle.
It is brilliant engineering, which makes the history of the 1876 campaign so baffling to me. Because our sources note a very specific interaction before the 7th Cavalry marched toward the Little Bighorn. General Alfred Terry, the commander of the entire Dakota column, explicitly offered General George Custer a battery of these rapid-fire Gatling guns.
He absolutely did. Terry had a detachment of Gatling guns at his disposal, and he offered to attach them to Custer's strike force.
And Custer says, no, thank you.
Right.
I mean, if I am a commander and I'm heading into hostile, unmapped territory against an unknown number of warriors, and my boss offers me a machine that shoots 350 times a minute, why on earth would I turn that down? It sounds like suicidal arrogance.
It's really easy to look back with modern eyes and assume it was pure hubris. We naturally worship firepower today. But to understand Custer's refusal, we have to deeply analyze the Gatling gun's fatal flaws, specifically in the context of the Great Plains environment and the cavalry doctrine of that era.
All right, let's dissect the machine then. What was the fatal flaw?
The first and most glaring issue was mobility. Custer's entire doctrine was predicated on relentless speed. The 7th Cavalry was designed to track, pursue, and force an engagement with a highly mobile, nomadic enemy.
Right, they had to be fast.
Exactly. Custer famously operated under the belief that the 7th can handle anything it meets. He did not want to be tethered to a slow-moving logistical train.
And a Gatling gun isn't something a guy just slings over his back on a horse, is it?
Far from it. The Gatling guns of the 1870s were categorized and deployed as artillery pieces. They were heavy, brass, and steel mechanisms bolted onto massive wooden artillery carriages with large iron-rimmed wheels. They weighed hundreds of pounds.
You have to pull them with a team of horses. If the cavalry is on horses and the guns are pulled by horses, shouldn't they be able to keep up?
In a perfect world, yes. But we have to look at the brutal logistics of the post-war frontier army. The military was completely starved for budget. They did not have dedicated, strong, heavy draft horses specifically assigned to the artillery battery.
So what do they use?
The sources detail that these heavy Gatling carriages were pulled by what the Army officially classified as condemned cavalry mounts.
Condemned mounts, like they were being punished.
No, like they were practically dead. These were horses that had essentially been worked to death. They were deemed entirely unfit to carry a cavalry rider anymore. They were old, diseased, lame, or half-starved.
You're kidding.
Not at all. The Army's logic was, well, they can't carry a man, so let's strap them to a heavy wooden wagon and make them pull artillery.
That is absurd. You are trusting the most advanced, highest firepower weapon system in your entire arsenal to the weakest, most broken-down animals in the regiment. You're practically guaranteeing they won't make it to the battlefield.
And Custer knew this from firsthand experience. The terrain of the Dakota frontier is not a flat, paved road. Specifically, the areas around the Rosebud and Little Bighorn rivers are a nightmare of deep ravines, steep coulees, and broken, rocky ground. The Gatling guns were incredibly top-heavy. All the weight, the brass hopper full of ammunition, the heavy steel barrels, the crank mechanism sat high up on the axle.
So if you hit a rut on a steep hill.
Exactly. And this isn't theoretical. 2 years prior, during the 1874 Black Hills expedition, Custer's column brought Gatling guns along. The terrain was so rough that one of these top-heavy guns hit an angle, overturned, rolled completely down the side of a mountain, and shattered to pieces.
Wow, so he watched his firepower just turn into kindling.
He did. He knew that dragging these carriages through the ravines of the Little Bighorn would slow his cavalry to a crawl, allowing the native encampments to simply pack up and scatter before he could ever strike.
Okay, the mobility argument makes total sense. They are heavy, fragile anchors pulled by dying horses. But let's say, hypothetically, he gets them to the battlefield and sets them up. They still shoot 350 rounds a minute. Isn't that worth the hassle?
It would be if the weapon was reliable. But we have to look at the internal mechanics and the chemical reality of the era. We have to talk about black powder again.
Right, because smokeless powder hasn't been invented yet. The Gatlings are still firing the exact same dirty, sulfur-heavy compound the muskets were using.
Precisely. Black powder burns incredibly dirty. It leaves behind a thick, heavy, greasy carbon residue that we call fouling. Every single time a cartridge fires, a layer of this sticky soot coats the inside of the chamber and the moving parts.
And the Gatling is firing 350 times a minute. The sheer volume of soot must have been astronomical.
It acts like a glue. As the gunner cranks the handle, the complex internal gears are trying to smoothly load and extract cartridges. But as that sticky black powder fouling builds up second by second, the friction increases exponentially.
Making it harder to crank.
The crank gets harder and harder to turn. The tight tolerances of the extractor start to bind, and inevitably the mechanism fails. The gun jams.
I mean, a jam in a single-shot rifle is bad enough. A jam in a complex, multi-geared machine gun sounds like a mechanic's nightmare.
It required specialized tools and time to disassemble the housing, clear the jammed casing, scrape out the fouling, and reassemble it. Time is the one luxury you do not have in the middle of a chaotic cavalry charge.
Yeah, definitely not.
But even if we ignore the mobility, and even if we pretend the gun never jams, there is a third, perhaps most terrifying flaw when you look at the human element of operating this machine.
A human target.
Exactly. Because the gun is mounted on artillery wheels, the mechanism sits about chest high. To operate the hand crank, the gunner cannot lie down. He cannot crouch behind a boulder. He has to stand completely upright, in the open, positioned directly behind the gun, violently turning a crank in a wide circular motion.
You are standing up, waving your arms, operating a loud smoking machine. You are a massive beacon saying, "Shoot me first."
And you have to consider who they were fighting, the Lakota and the Cheyenne. These were not the rigid infantry lines of the Civil War who just marched forward shoulder to shoulder.
Right, they didn't fight like that.
The native warriors were masters of irregular mobile warfare. They were highly skilled sharpshooters who used the terrain brilliantly. They would fire from behind sagebrush, from deep ravines, from horseback. If an artillery crew stood upright on the open prairie to crank a jammed Gatling gun, they would be picked off by Cheyenne marksmen in a matter of seconds.
So, synthesizing all of this, Custer looks at the Gatling guns. He sees a top-heavy, fragile carriage pulled by a half-dead horse prone to catastrophic mechanical jams because of black powder sludge, operated by a guy who has to stand up and act as a sniper magnet.
Yep.
Turning them down isn't arrogance at all. It's a brutal, calculated tactical assessment of the environment.
Exactly. Heavy, wheeled, rapid-fire artillery was simply the wrong tool for a war of extreme mobility. The environment dictated that if the Army wanted rapid fire, they needed individual personal rapid-fire weapons that a single man could carry on a horse. They needed to move the firepower from the wagon wheel to the saddle.
And that leads us to the next massive evolution, the repeater revolution.
Right.
If the machine gun was a dead end for the cavalry, we have to talk about the lever-action repeating rifles.
This is where the geometry of the firefight changes forever. We are talking specifically about the Henry rifle, patented in 1860 by Benjamin Tyler Henry, and its direct successor, the Winchester model, 1866.
Let's break down the mechanics here, because this is genius engineering. How does a lever action solve the terrible 9-step dance of the muzzle-loader?
The secret is the tubular magazine and the metallic cartridge. Instead of separate paper, loose powder, and lead balls, the ammunition is entirely self-contained in a brass or copper casing, the .44 caliber rimfire cartridge.
Okay.
The Henry and the Winchester featured a long metal tube that ran directly underneath the entire length of the barrel. Inside that tube was a coiled spring.
So the soldier just feeds bullets into the tube, compressing the spring.
Yes. A Winchester 1866 could hold up to 16 rounds of ammunition fully loaded inside that tube. Now, beneath the trigger guard is elongated into an iron loop, or a lever. When the soldier is ready to fire, he grabs that lever and pushes it downward and forward in one swift motion.
And what happens inside the gun when he pushes the lever down?
A whole symphony of mechanics. Pushing the lever down does three things simultaneously. First, it slides the bolt back, cocking the hammer. Second, if there's an empty shell in the chamber, an extractor claw pulls it out and ejects it out the top of the gun.
Nice.
Third, a brass elevator block inside the receiver lifts a fresh cartridge from the spring-loaded magazine tube up to the level of the chamber.
And then when you pull the lever back up into place,
the bolt slides forward, shoving that fresh cartridge directly into the chamber, and the gun is locked and ready to fire.
it's one smooth, fluid motion. Down, up, clack, clack.
And crucially, the most important psychological and tactical advantage. The shooter never has to take his eye off the target. He never has to lower the rifle from his shoulder.
He doesn't have to stand up.
Exactly. He can be lying flat on his stomach behind a log, peering down the sights, and simply work the lever with his wrist. Fire lever, unleashing 16 aim shots in less than 20 seconds.
So wait, you have a weapon that allows a single man on horseback to carry 16 shots, fire them continuously without losing his sight picture, and reload from a prone position.
Yes.
It seems like the absolute perfect, tailor-made solution for cavalry fighting a highly mobile war on the plains. Why didn't the U.S. Army just buy 50,000 Winchesters and hand them to every trooper heading west?
To understand why they didn't, we have to explore the deep psychological root of the Army's fear. We have to talk about the concept of strategic obsolescence.
Okay.
The U.S. Army brass in the post-Civil War era were not evaluating weapons based on the brutal reality of the Great Plains. They were rigidly, almost dogmatically trapped in European-style mass formation military doctrine.
They were preparing for the war they wanted to fight, not the one they were actually fighting.
Completely. The military establishment in Washington viewed the Plains Indian Wars as a nuisance, a minor sideshow to proper military history. Their true focus, their institutional anxiety, was centered on equipping and training their men to fight a hypothetical, fully equipped European army, like the Prussians or the French, or perhaps to refight the massive set-piece battles of the American Civil War.
Okay, but even in a European war, wouldn't 16 shots be better than one?
Not according to 19th century military doctrine. In a European conflict, armies fought in long, disciplined lines. The goal was to exchange massive, controlled volleys of fire at the absolute maximum range to break the enemy's formation before they could close with bayonets.
So it's all about control.
Exactly. In that specific context, rapid, individual, aimed fire wasn't seen as an advantage. It was viewed as a profound, terrifying threat to order.
A threat to order. They were literally afraid of their own men.
They called it a breach of fire discipline. This is an anxiety that goes back decades. If we want to understand the mindset of the 1870s generals, we have to look back to the Napoleonic Wars.
Oh, really? That far back?
Yeah. During the early 1800s, Napoleon's army outright rejected the widespread use of the rifled musket. Why? Because it was slower to load than a smoothbore. And Napoleon relied entirely on massed shock tactics, artillery, and the discipline of the bayonet charge. He didn't want individuals pausing to aim. He wanted a wall of men moving forward.
But his opponents felt differently.
Yes. The Duke of Wellington, fighting the French in the Iberian Peninsula, understood the value of individual aimed fire. He deployed regiments of green-jacketed riflemen armed with the Baker rifle.
And what did they do differently?
These men didn't stand in rigid lines. They operated in pairs, taking cover behind trees and rocks, operating outside the rigid command structure. And their specific job was to pick off French officers and artillery crews at long range.
Which, by the standards of the day, was considered deeply unsportsmanlike. You aren't supposed to target the aristocratic officers.
It was scandalous, but highly effective. However, the institutional military mind despises anything that disrupts top-down control. The U.S. Army brass of the 1870s inherited this exact distrust of the individual soldier making his own firing decisions.
So they didn't trust the average trooper.
Not at all. They firmly, genuinely believed that if you handed a frightened, poorly trained cavalry recruit a Winchester with 16 shots in the magazine, he would completely lose his mind.
The fear of spray and pray.
Exactly. They believed he would abandon his sights, panic, and just furiously work the lever, blasting all 16 rounds into the dirt or the sky in 30 seconds.
So their fear was logistical. If every soldier sprays 16 rounds at shadows, the regiment runs out of bullets on day one.
Rapid, uncontrolled depletion of ammunition in an environment where your supply lines stretch for hundreds of miles across hostile territory. It was a valid logistical fear, but it blinded them to the tactical necessity. Furthermore, the ordnance experts, the engineers evaluating these guns, viewed the lever-action repeaters with deep skepticism. They officially categorized them as underpowered novelty weapons.
Wait, a gun that shoots 16 times is an underpowered novelty. Explain the physics behind that assessment. Why did they think it was underpowered?
It comes down to the mechanics of the lever-action elevator. To reliably cycle a cartridge out of the tubular magazine, lift it up, and slide it into the chamber, the cartridge itself has to be relatively short.
Oh, because if it's too long, it gets stuck in the mechanism.
Exactly. If the bullet is too long, the mechanical elevator gets jammed. Because the .44 caliber rimfire round had to be short, it could only hold a relatively small charge of black powder compared to a full-sized military rifle.
Less powder means less velocity.
Less velocity, significantly shorter range, and less kinetic stopping power. The brass argued that a soldier with a Winchester couldn't effectively hit a target at 600 yards. They envisioned a scenario where a soldier empties his 16-shot magazine rapidly, hits nothing because the range is too far, and is now holding an empty gun.
And reloading a tubular magazine isn't fast. You have to slide the bullets in one at a time.
Right. They pictured a soldier frantically trying to feed bullets into the tube one by one, while a disciplined line of European infantry marched toward him with fixed bayonets.
It is stunning.
Yeah.
They are entirely fixated on a phantom enemy. They're having nightmares about European infantry advancing with bayonets, while the actual enemy they're sending these troops to fight, the Lakota and the Cheyenne, are highly mobile horseback warriors who excel at devastating close-quarters combat.
It is the definition of strategic obsolescence. This rigid, European-focused theoretical mindset wasn't just abstract philosophy being debated in drawing rooms in Washington. It had tangible, fatal consequences.
Because it decided their gear.
It directly dictated the specific pieces of metal the soldiers of the 7th Cavalry would be holding in their hands when they rode down into the valley of the Little Bighorn.
Which brings us to a pivotal, tragic moment. The 1872 Army Ordnance Board.
The 1872 board, often called the Terry Board, was convened by the military to conduct exhaustive tests of both foreign and domestic firearms. Their mandate was to finally select a single standard-issue weapon for the entire United States Army.
They tested a lot of guns, didn't they?
They tested over 100 different designs. They looked at the lever-action repeaters we just discussed. They looked at bolt-action rifles from Europe. They looked at various dropping block breech loaders.
And the irony of this board is who was sitting on it. The sources note two specific names evaluating these weapons.
Yes, the board included Major Marcus Reno and General Alfred Terry.
The exact same men who would be commanding the Dakota Column and the 7th Cavalry at the Little Bighorn 4 years later. They were literally sitting in a room, evaluating the guns, making the decisions that would dictate their own survival.
History is full of these dark, tragic ironies, and after months of exhaustive testing, shooting these guns in controlled environments, the board explicitly rejected the repeating rifles. They passed on the Winchester and the Henry.
So what did they choose to arm the frontier army with?
They chose to adopt the single-shot, breech-loading Springfield model 1873 carbine chambered for a heavy .45-55 caliber metallic cartridge.
Let's dissect this decision.
Yeah.
We know they were terrified of spray and pray, We know they thought repeaters were underpowered. How did they scientifically and tactically justify forcing men back to a single-shot weapon in an era when 16-shot technology existed?
They justified it on 3 pillars: range, stopping power, and enforced discipline. The .45 55 caliber round of the Springfield was a massive piece of ammunition. It featured a heavy 405-grain lead bullet backed by 55 grains of black powder.
So unlike the short little Winchester bullet,
Yeah.
this thing packed a serious wallop.
It was devastating. It had the kinetic energy to easily drop a horse or a man at 600 yards. The board argued that the stopping power was non-negotiable. Furthermore, they argued that the Springfield enforced fire discipline through mechanical limitation.
Because it forced the soldier to slow down.
Exactly. To fire the Springfield, a soldier had to pull the hammer back, manually flip open a hinged steel block at the back of the barrel, which is the trapdoor extract, the empty copper shell, reach into his belt, pull out a new massive bullet, shove it into the chamber, snap the trapdoor closed, aim and fire.
For every single shot.
For every single shot. The board concluded that a disciplined soldier, carefully pacing himself, would maintain a higher sustainable rate of accurate fire over the course of a 3-hour battle than a panicking man who burned through a 16-shot magazine in a minute and then ran out of ammo.
If you listen to this and think, wait, they engineered a gun specifically to slow their own men down.
Yes, that is exactly what happened. They essentially built a mechanical speed bump into the weapon to prevent the soldiers from shooting too fast.
But tactically, that was only part of the story. There was another, perhaps even more powerful justification that lurked beneath the military doctrine: the brutal reality of money.
Ah, yes. The budget. It always comes down to the budget. The financial reality of the U.S. Army in 1872 was grim. The nation was still reeling from the massive debts incurred during the Civil War. Congress had severely slashed the military budget.
And who was in charge of that?
The Secretary of War, William Belknap, who was later impeached for corruption, by the way, was running a starved, penny-pinching department.
And I imagine buying complex, state-of-the-art repeating rifles wasn't exactly cheap.
It was incredibly expensive.
Right.
Repeating rifles have complex internal mechanics, springs, elevators, tubular magazines. They require precise machining. Furthermore, the patents for the Henry and the Winchester were owned by private corporations.
If the government wanted them.
If the government wanted to equip the entire army with Winchesters, they would have to pay massive royalty fees to the Winchester Repeating Arms Company.
Whereas the Springfield.
The Springfield was a bargain. The specific breech-loading mechanism they chose, known as the Allen Trapdoor, was designed by Erskine Allen, and he was the master armorer at the government-owned Springfield Armory in Massachusetts.
Oh, I see.
Because he was a government employee, the U.S. government owned the patent. There were absolutely no royalty fees to pay to a private corporation.
So it's an in-house design.
Not only was it an in-house design, but the manufacturing infrastructure was already in place. The Allen Trapdoor system had initially been designed right after the Civil War as a cheap way to convert the millions of leftover muzzle loaders into breech loaders.
They just modified the old guns?
Yeah, they just chopped the back off the barrel and bolted the trapdoor on. By 1873, the Springfield Armory had all the milling machines, the tools, and the workforce specifically calibrated to churn out this exact design for pennies on the dollar.
So the decision to arm Custer's men with a single-shot weapon wasn't just about the lofty ideals of fire discipline. It was driven by a slashed post-war budget, a desire to avoid paying corporate royalties, and a fantasy of fighting a European war at 600 yards.
That is the tragedy of the Ordnance Board. Economics and a rigid doctrine doomed the frontier cavalrymen. They selected a weapon that was mathematically and theoretically perfect for long-range, disciplined volley fire against a slow-moving, conventional enemy.
But that wasn't who they were fighting.
No. They handed that weapon to troops who were being sent to face the Lakota and the Cheyenne, a highly mobile enemy fighting a guerrilla-style war of rapid movement, ambush, and close-quarters cavalry charges.
They evaluated this weapon in a sterile, controlled testing environment back east. A target range with white sand and no one shooting back. But a weapon isn't just an abstract design on a blueprint. It is physical pieces of metal rubbing against other pieces of metal.
Right.
What happens to the mechanics of the Springfield when it's actually fired in the dusty, chaotic, 100-degree heat of a life-or-death struggle on the plains?
This is where our technological thriller takes its darkest turn. Because we have to talk about the flaw in the field. We have to talk about the copper cartridge.
Right, so the Army issues the Model 1873 Springfield, and they supply the troops with millions of rounds of .45-55 caliber ammunition. But the casings of these cartridges aren't made of brass like modern ammunition. They were made of copper.
Yes. And the metallurgy of that copper is the root of an alleged catastrophe. During the Battle of the Little Bighorn, survivors reported that these weapons jammed disastrously. And the mechanics of the jam are not a mystery. They are terrifyingly simple, rooted purely in the laws of physics, heat, and chemistry.
Let's walk through the physics of the jam. What happens when you pull the trigger?
Consider the metallurgical properties of copper. Copper is a relatively soft, highly malleable metal. When you fire a heavy .45-55 caliber cartridge, there is a massive, instantaneous spike in temperature and pressure inside the breech of the rifle.
Makes sense.
The soft copper casing is designed to expand outward under that pressure to seal the chamber, preventing hot gases from blowing back into the shooter's face.
That sounds like it's working exactly as intended.
It is, on the first shot. But remember what we established about black powder. It leaves a thick, greasy, sticky carbon residue everywhere.
Right, the fouling.
So after you've fired 10 or 15 rounds rapidly, the inside of your steel chamber is heavily shelled. It's coated in sticky, unburned powder sludge. Now, you insert a fresh copper cartridge, you fire.
And it expands again.
The soft copper violently expands under the extreme heat and pressure. It presses outward against the steel walls of the chamber, but those walls are now coated in a sticky carbon glue. The expanding copper practically fuses itself to the fouled walls.
Okay, but you still have to get the empty casing out to load the next bullet. The Trapdoor Springfield has a mechanism for this, right? An extractor.
It does. It has a small spring-loaded steel hook designed to catch the rim of the cartridge and pry it backward when you flip the trapdoor open. But the early model 1873 Springfield had a notoriously weak, narrow, sharply pointed extractor hook.
Oh no, I see where this is going.
Imagine the soldier. He fires. The copper casing swells and glues itself to the chamber. He desperately yanks the trapdoor open to reload. The narrow steel hook of the extractor catches the rim of the soft copper.
But it's stuck.
Because the copper is stuck so firmly to the walls, the steel hook acts like a can opener. It violently tears completely through the soft copper rim, shearing the head of the cartridge right off.
Leaving the swollen, headless copper tube hopelessly jammed inside the barrel.
Yes. The extractor now has nothing left to grab onto. The mechanism is entirely bypassed. The weapon is useless. The only way to clear it is for the soldier to stop fighting, dig his fingernails in, or, as was widely reported, take out his pocket knife, slide the blade into the chamber, and frantically try to pry and gouge the swelling copper tube out of the hot steel.
I try to put myself on that hill. I cannot even fathom the sheer human terror of that consequence. You are choking on dust. Hundreds of warriors are charging up the ravine. The noise is just a physical weight on your chest. Your friends are dying beside you.
It's unimaginable.
And you are forced to stare down at a broken piece of metal, furiously digging at a hot copper tube with a pocket knife, while someone is running at you with a war club.
It is the ultimate nightmare scenario for a soldier. Your equipment has betrayed you, and you are reduced to being a frantic spectator to your own demise.
So this brings up the most crucial question of the episode. Did this exact mechanical failure, the copper cartridge flaw, cost Custer the battle? Is this the singular reason the 7th Cavalry was wiped out?
That is one of the most fiercely debated, highly contested topics among historians and ordnance experts regarding the Little Bighorn. If you look purely at the historical testimony, specifically the accounts given by surviving officers at the Reno Court of Inquiry in 1879, you get a picture of catastrophic, widespread mechanical failure.
What did the officers say at the inquiry?
Men like Major Reno and Captain Benteen testified that troops were constantly struggling with jammed weapons. They reported that officers had to stop commanding the battle and physically go down the firing line with knives, manually clearing the chambers for their panicked, terrified men.
So they blamed the guns.
The testimony paints a picture of a regiment paralyzed by faulty copper.
That testimony sounds pretty definitive. I mean, these are the guys who were actually there.
It does sound definitive until you look at the ground itself. The testimony and the physical evidence are at war with each other. Modern archaeological evidence gathered directly at the battlefield tells a surprisingly different, highly nuanced story.
How so? What did they find?
In the 1980s, a team of archaeologists, led prominently by Dr. Richard Fox, conducted extensive, rigorous metal detector surveys of the entire battlefield. They established meticulous grid systems. They dug up and cataloged thousands of spent .4555 cartridge casings that had lain in the dirt for a century.
And if the weapons were jamming everywhere, those casings should show the evidence, right?
Exactly. If a soldier is digging a swollen copper casing out of a steel chamber with a sharp pocket knife, that steel blade is going to leave deep, undeniable gouges, scratches, and pry marks on the soft copper rim.
Right, metal on metal.
If the testimony of widespread failure was entirely accurate, you would expect to see those pry marks on 10, 20, maybe 30% of the recovered casings.
What did Dr. Fox's team actually find?
The data dramatically contradicts the testimony. The archaeologists found that at the Custer site, where the fatal 5 companies were wiped out, only about 3.4% of the recovered casings showed the telltale scratch marks of a pocket knife extraction.
3.4%, that is incredibly low.
At the Reno-Benteen defense site, where the troops survived and held out for 2 days, the rate was even lower, only 2.7%.
Wait, so less than 4% of the guns actually jammed. How do we reconcile that massive discrepancy? Are the surviving officers simply lying to protect their reputations and blaming the guns?
They aren't necessarily lying, but we have to view their testimony through the intense, distorting lens of battlefield psychology. The archaeological record suggests that the jam rate was statistically low, maybe 1 jam for every 30 shots fired.
Okay.
To an Ordnance Board testing weapons in Washington, a 3% failure rate is considered highly successful. It's statistically negligible.
But on a hill surrounded by warriors, statistics don't matter.
Precisely. Consider the outsized psychological impact of a single failure in a life-or-death situation. Put yourself back on that skirmish line. You are terrified. You look to your left and you see the man next to you screaming, frantically digging at his jammed rifle with a knife. You look to your right and another man throws his useless, jammed Springfield onto the ground in despair.
Even if my gun is working perfectly, the seed of doubt is planted. Every single time I'll load a copper cartridge and pull the trigger, I am waiting for the gun to fail.
The psychological terror of the jam is highly infectious. The panic spreads far faster than the mechanical failure itself. The soldiers felt profoundly betrayed by their equipment. A 3% failure rate is enough to shatter the confidence of an entire company if they believe their weapons might turn into useless clubs at the worst possible moment.
It's the perception of failure leading to the collapse of morale. And we have to contrast this reality. A regiment armed with uniform, single shot, occasionally jamming Springfields, with the absolute chaos of the weaponry waiting for them in the valley.
This brings us to the technological collision. When the 7th Cavalry rode into the village at the Greasy Grass, what exactly were they facing?
The myth is that it was cavalry with modern guns versus natives with bows and arrows. But the sources shatter that completely.
The Lakota and Cheyenne forces possessed a stunningly diverse, highly lethal array of weapons. It was not a monolithic force. It has been described by historians as an archaeological timeline of warfare, with every era of combat happening simultaneously on a single battlefield.
Let's break down that timeline, starting with the foundation.
The foundation was traditional weaponry, which the cavalry severely underestimated at their own peril. We're talking about stone-headed war clubs, iron-tipped lances, and the traditional bow and arrow.
How effective is a bow and arrow against a soldier with a rifle?
Devastatingly effective in the specific terrain of the Little Bighorn. The bow was silent. It didn't produce a massive cloud of white smoke to give away the shooter's position.
Right, no smoke.
It didn't suffer from sticky black powder fouling, and it never jammed. A highly skilled Cheyenne warrior could loose multiple aimed arrows in the time it took a cavalryman to reload his Trapdoor Springfield once.
And the sources say an arrow could maim a trooper from 30 yards away.
Easily. And, tactically, an injured, screaming man with an arrow in his shoulder takes far more resources, requires men to drag him to safety, and causes far more psychological damage to a unit's morale than a dead man.
But the native arsenal wasn't just bows and arrows. Moving up the timeline, they had a vast amount of trade firearms.
Yes. The U.S. government, through various treaty conventions and annuity distributions, had actually provided the tribes with muzzle-loading smoothbores, often called Lehman Indian trade muskets. They were provided ostensibly for hunting buffalo.
So the government literally handed them the guns they were now facing in combat.
Exactly. And beyond the smoothbore trade muskets, there were hundreds of surplus Civil War rifled muskets on the field. Weapons exactly like the .577 Enfield and the Springfield 1861 that we discussed at the beginning of the deep dive.
The slow 9-step muzzle loaders.
Yes. They were slow to load, but in the hands of a hidden sniper, they had massive range and bone-shattering stopping power.
But the real shock, the technological leap that caught Custer's battalions completely off guard, was the absolute cutting edge of the native arsenal.
This is where the U.S. Army's doctrine of strategic obsolescence becomes fatal. Historians estimate that between 1/3 and 1/2 of the warriors at the Greasy Grass possessed firearms, and crucially, a significant portion of them had acquired modern rapid-fire metal cartridge weapons.
How did they get them? We just established that the Army brass thought these weapons were too expensive and advanced for their own enlisted troops. How did the Lakota and Cheyenne get their hands on state-of-the-art repeating rifles?
Through the brutal efficiency of frontier capitalism and black market corruption, they acquired them from licensed and unlicensed post-traders, from Indian agents looking to make a profit, and from highly effective clandestine gun runners like the Métis operating out of Canada or the desolate, unpoliced regions near the Black Hills.
The warriors knew what worked.
They absolutely knew what worked. They didn't care about European fire discipline or logistical theories. They knew that a gun that shot 16 times was better than a gun that shot once. They traded their most valuable commodities, buffalo robes, pelts, and gold dust, for the absolute best technology available on the open market.
So they were well armed.
They carried Spencer carbines, heavy Sharps buffalo rifles that could hit a target at 1,000 yards, and most devastatingly, an estimated 200 Winchester model 1866 and Henry lever-action repeating rifles.
200 repeating rifles. 16 shots apiece.
Fired by highly skilled, highly motivated marksmen who were defending their families, their land, and their very existence.
We have to zero in on the climax of this technological collision. The sources detail a specific location on the battlefield where the Ordnance Revolution dictated the outcome of the fight. Let's look at Calhoun Hill. Set the scene for us.
Calhoun Hill represents a critical, agonizing moment in the disintegration of Custer's 5 companies. Lieutenant James Calhoun commanded L Company. As the native forces advanced up the ravines, Calhoun deployed his men in a classic, textbook, European-style skirmish line along the crest of the ridge.
So the men are spaced out, kneeling or lying prone, trying to hold the high ground.
Yes, they are armed with their single-shot Springfields. They are under strict orders to maintain that beloved fire discipline. They are spacing their shots, aiming carefully, trying to conserve ammunition. Remember, to save weight, the cavalry had been ordered to leave their sabers behind in the wagons. They had nothing but their single-shot rifles and their Colt revolvers to hold the line.
And what hits that skirmish line?
Decades later, during the archaeological digs in the 1980s, Dr. Fox and his team uncovered a massive, shocking cluster of artifacts in a small depression just below Calhoun Hill. The area was so concentrated with Pacific casings that historians now refer to it simply as Henryville.
Henryville, named after the Henry repeating rifle.
Exactly. The metal detectors found an incredibly dense concentration of .44 caliber rimfire cartridge casings, and this is where the forensics are amazing. By examining the unique microscopic striations and firing pin indentations on the back of those recovered casings, acting like 19th century crime scene investigators, the archaeologists were able to determine that those casings were fired by approximately 20 individual Henry and Winchester repeating rifles.
Just 20 guys.
Just 20 warriors. But those 20 warriors, armed with 16-shot repeaters, maneuvered into a ravine just below the cavalry line and unleashed an intimidating, relentless, continuous barrage of rapid fire up the hill.
Try to conceptualize the sheer volume of lead hitting L Company. You are a cavalryman. You fire your Springfield. You pop open the trapdoor, frantically hoping the copper casing doesn't shear off. You reach for another bullet, and while you are doing that, the warrior across from you, using a Henry, is laying down a continuous curtain of lead. Clack, clack, fire, clack, clack, fire.
It must have sounded like a solid, unyielding wall of noise. It was physically and psychologically overwhelming. The sheer, concentrated volume of fire from those repeaters made it impossible for the cavalrymen to raise their heads to aim. It pinned them down, broke their morale, and ultimately drove Lieutenant Calhoun's L Company from the ridge.
They broke the line.
The line shattered. The inexperienced, dust-choked troops panicked and fled back toward Captain Keogh's position. That panicked, chaotic retreat triggered a domino effect, the ultimate catastrophic disintegration of Custer's entire battalion.
The technology that the Washington Army brass arrogantly rejected as an underpowered novelty weapon, is the exact piece of technology that broke their skirmish line and annihilated their troops.
The irony is profound, and it is devastating. The U.S. military establishment attempted to dictate the terms of reality based on their own internal doctrines, their historical biases, and their slashed budgets. The Lakota and the Cheyenne simply brought the most effective cutting-edge tools to the battlefield.
It is an incredible, sobering story. To synthesize this entire journey we've been on, between 1861 and 1876, the firearm underwent a massive, violent evolution. In just 15 years, warfare went from the slow, exposed, bite-and-pour muzzle-loader to the devastating 16-shot lever-action repeater. It was a paradigm shift in how human beings inflicted violence upon one another.
Yet, at the greasy grass, a budget-starved army, blinded by their obsession with European combat doctrine and their inflexible belief in enforcing fire discipline through mechanical imitation, collided with a highly mobile, highly motivated force that was wielding the very repeating technology the military establishment had actively scorned.
It was a 12-year technological leap that the institution deliberately chose not to see.
And that leads to a lingering question, one that I think resonates far beyond the dust of the 19th century. Think about the massive institutions of today. Our governments, our militaries, our tech companies, our corporations.
Yeah.
When an organization becomes completely dogmatically obsessed with preparing for the war they want to fight, or the war they fought yesterday, what massive blind spots are they creating in the present? How often does a rigid institutional doctrine blind us to the undeniable, evolving reality right in front of our faces until we are already standing on the battlefield?
That is something to mull over. Thank you all so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the narratives you've been taught, look closer at the mechanics of history, and we will catch you next time.